Hi, everyone. I'm Francine Lacroix from Bloomberg TV, and I couldn't be more happy to be here with you for the B20-G20 special dialogue, unlocking investment in maritime transportation infrastructure for a more sustainable trade. Now, this is an event co-organized by the Finance and Infrastructure and the Trade and Investment Task Forces in cooperation with the B20 network partner International Chamber of Shipping and with the support of Confitarma. Now, I've been absolutely fascinated by, of course, this industry. The maritime transport sector is evolving during a pretty pivotal moment as it confronts both immediate challenges resulting from the pandemic, but of course, longer term issues. So we'll be together for the next 90 minutes to try and figure out some of the challenges, how the B20 can help, and some of the way forward in some of everything that's been arising over the 15 months that has been complicated for the industry and many others. So it is my great pleasure, without further ado, to give the floor now to Emma Marcegaglia to give her opening remarks. She is B20 chair. Emma, over to you.
Thank you, Francine. Honorable Minister Giovannini, dear Barbara and Ruggero, President Paulsen and Mattiolo, dear B20 chairs and members, distinguished guests. I'm really happy to welcome you to this B20-G20 Dialogue, organized, as Francine said, by Confindustria in cooperation with ICS and Confitarma, the Italian Confederation of Ship Owners. Before deep diving into the very topic of today, let me give you a snapshot of what the B20 is about. Well, our Italian B20 gathers together more than 2,000 representatives, including all major international corporations. And what I can tell you is that we see a lot of interest in this B20. I think because, 2021, we all think that will be a year of a turning point. We hope that this will be the year of the defeating of the virus and return to a growth, but a different kind of growth, more inclusive and more sustainable compared with the growth that we had before. In fact, our claim of our B20 is reshape the future, include, share, and act. Well, our main goals at B20 are very clear. The first is to identify the priorities to enhance this new sustainable and inclusive growth. The second is to convey policy recommendation to the G20 governments and to call for concrete action, which is what is needed in this moment. And the third, of course, is also to take a strong responsibility on ourselves as business to reduce inequality, to generate employment, to spread innovation, and to fight climate change. So we think that our role is key, and we want really to commit on this. Of course, we also work together with some 20 prominent Italian CEOs who help us in the advisory board. We also work together with the most important Federation of Industry and also with the most important global CEOs that help us in these strategic headlines. We have 8 task force for one special initiative in all the most important point of our global agenda, talking about trade. Today we talk about trade in finance infrastructure, but also energy, integrity, employment, health, life and science, women empowerment, and sustainability and global emergence. What I wanted to tell you is that we did something new compared with the previous B20. We decided that now it's very important to set KPI. First of all, to estimate the impact of our policy recommendation as compared with the UN SDGs and the Italian G20 priority, which is people, planet, and prosperity. But also we set some KPIs in our policy recommendation because we think it's very important to measure what is going on and also the execution of the policy recommendation. So just to give an example, today we are talking about trade and investment task force. We set a KPI on World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement. We know that only 70% of what has been decided has been implemented, but we think that if this implementation will increase by 10% in the next 3 years, we will have very important point. And also on finance and infrastructure tax, we chose a KPI on trade finance. The gap between global demand and offer is about 3.4 trillion. We said, well, in 3 years, we'd like to have this gap going down to 2 trillion. So just to give you an example that we want to be very committed, but also very pragmatic, which is, I think, very important. We are about to conclude our policy papers, and now we are in this advocacy phase. And events like the one we are going today are part of our advocacy phase to reach out the G20 presidency and also the most prominent international organization. Today we are here with Minister Giovannini, and we really thank him for his commitment. Tomorrow we will hold an event with the Director General of FAO. Next week with Barbara and George Denton, we will be engaged in the WTO trade dialogue with the new Director General. On the 16th of July, we will have an OECD plenary meeting, and we will work with the business at OECD, best known as BF. So just to say that we are very active. We will also have other dialogues with the most relevant Italian minister, and I want really to thank the Italian government for his willingness to work with us. And on the 7th of October, we will deliver the conclusion to the Italian Prime Minister. So just to give you an idea of what we are doing. So now let me briefly go to our agenda of today. The agenda of today will focus on two very important factors that are maritime transportation infrastructure and global trade, two topics that are deeply interconnected. Approximately 90% of global trade by volume and over 70% by value are carried by sea. So this is a very important strategic point. According to the UN, this means over 100 billion tons of cargo transported in 2019, with an estimated value of $14 trillion. Maritime trade has doubled between the 2000 and 2008, before falling by 0.5% in 2019 and by roughly 4% last year due to the pandemic. This simple data witness how an efficient global maritime transportation sector is crucial in putting the global trade back on track and in stimulating the post-COVID recovery. But there is one more figure that I want to underline that sounds self-explanatory. With the pandemic crisis, the impact of custom overload on shipping delivery increased cost of custom clearance by almost 30 times worldwide. So this is an incredible burden over business shoulder. So we have to talk about that. Today's discussion will also involve the need to increase energy efficiency and sustainability in global value chain and to mobilize public and private investment. All these issues are at the core of our B20 agenda, especially of the task force's trade in investment and finance and infrastructure. With a special view at the first task force, our commitment, and Barbara will talk about that, is to invert protectionism and restoring a sound multilateral governance. This is very important. Over the last decades, multilateral trading system has provided the basis for economic growth around the world. Therefore, revitalizing the World Trade Organization with a deep reform is of paramount importance, also to make global value chain more resilient and inclusive. Now, if we come to sustainable investment and infrastructure, we can tell you that, of course, these are also essential growth engines. We will call the G20 to enhance infrastructure financing by incentivizing investment in sustainable projects, implementing infrastructure as an asset class, and supporting cross-border planning and investing. Also, the discussion that we have seen in the G7 last days goes in this direction. Creating ad hoc and market-ready financial instruments to facilitate public-private partnership would greatly contribute to achieving this goal. To build back better, we need to invest in infrastructure that can support an inclusive, greener, and digitally enabled recovery. So I will conclude saying that all distinguished panelists that will take the floor later will provide further contribution on these matters, and we want to thank them. In particular, we are delighted to host Minister Giovannini, and I would like really to warm and thank him. Aside from his role as Minister of Sustainable Infrastructure and Mobility, which is one of the key points on which the government is working also due to the PNRR, is the co-founder and director of the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development, a coalition of more than 240 organizations established to implement the UN agenda in Italy, which is another very important point also for the business community. It will be of paramount importance, Minister Giovannini, to hear from you how sustainable infrastructure can become the basis for a more resilient and greener growth and for a more inclusive international trade. So, dear Minister, we're ready to work together with the G20 and to join our forces to make the 2021 the beginning of a new year. I thank all of you for your attention, and I wish you a fruitful meeting. Thank you very much.
Emma Marcigaglia, thank you so much for those opening remarks. Now let me give the floor to Espen Poulsen, the chairman of the International Chamber of Shipping, ICS. Over to you.
Thank you, Francine, and thank you, Emma, for your very interesting introductory remarks. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as the chairman of the Global Trade Association for Ship Owners and Operators, which represents the world's national ship owners associations, including our Italian member Confitama, and over 80% of the world merchant fleet, I'm very pleased that the B20 and the G20 are recognizing the critical importance of the maritime transport sector to the global economy. Throughout the pandemic, shipping has continued to keep trade flowing. This has only happened because of the tireless commitment and dedication of over 1.2 million seafarers worldwide who have continued to work to ensure that ships can transport nearly 90% of all goods. They have done this in the face of significant travel restrictions that have been imposed on them by governments across the world, even though the maritime sector has produced COVID-safe protocols for our industry, which have been endorsed not only by the United Nations, but also the International Maritime Organization. Global maritime trade, as Emma has already indicated, is valued at $14 trillion. Can you imagine the impact on the world if shipping itself had gone into lockdown? If shipping had succumbed to protectionist actions of governments, our discussions today about infrastructure for a more sustainable trade would be taking on a very different complexion. Therefore, I ask all of you here today to consider the seafarers and what we and you can do to help them as they have helped us. Dear colleagues, ICS is in full alignment with the B20 in supporting a reinvigoration of the multilateral trading system through the WTO. Improving the core functions of the WTO would increase the overall effectiveness and legitimacy of that organization. We are therefore very pleased with recommendation number 1, quote, to promote open markets over protectionism and unilateralism, reform the WTO, and revitalize trade negotiations. The G20 must continue to lead from the front by committing to a clear timeline for rolling back protectionist measures to trade and investment, agreeing on a practical WTO reform roadmap. Last year's G20 statement, the quote, READ initiative on the future of the WTO, was a significant step to identify common ground and principles for WTO reform among all G20 nations. The 4 recommendations by the Trade and Investment Task Force are very much complementary to that G20 vision. We also agree that more active engagement between WTO and the business community would greatly help to improve the core functions of the WTO, including ongoing negotiations, monitoring and assessing the impact of trade barriers, and on the drafting of trade policy reviews. To aid this work, ICS has produced a report entitled Protectionism in Maritime Economies, co-authored with Professor Craig Van Gastek of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, which found that reducing trade protectionism could see GDP gains for national economies increase by up to 3.4%. The report found that high-income countries could see an average increase of 4.5% in their goods exports if they were to loosen tariff and non-tariff restrictions on trade. Developing economies would experience an even greater increase of 7% if they reduced their restrictions in a, quote, modest and equal way. It is clear that the economic impact of the pandemic are being compounded by the knock-on effects of growing trade protectionism. Our report found that decades of progress towards open markets has begun to reverse in recent years, with damaging restrictions imposed as weapons in trade wars or in response to the pandemic. Factors such as overzealous anti-competitive licensing laws or discriminatory treatment of foreign companies were found to be up to 5 times as harmful to an economy as traditional tariffs. Removing tariff and non-tariff barriers are quick and easy tools available to policymakers to increase levels of GDP, making this a win-win situation in catalyzing economic recovery from COVID-19. In addition to my role as the chairman of the ICS, I'm also chairman of a Singapore-based ship-owning entity, so I understand very well the vital need to unlock investment in maritime transport infrastructure as we look to catalyze sustainable trade. As we speak today, the IMO are holding the 76th Marine Environmental Protection Committee meeting. On the agenda is the decarbonization of maritime transport. This is a vital challenge for our industry and for the world. Discussions at IMO can have profound impacts on global trade, and as such, they will need to be supported by actions by the G20 of ministers and other bodies such as the WTO. As shipping looks to transition to new zero emission fuels, we will need an urgent focus on investment in infrastructure to ensure that these newfound fuels will be available both in developed and developing economies. We must not allow a two-tier system to be established. As we move forward, it will be vital that we reduce the political and investment risk so that a pipeline of bankable projects can be developed so that global trade is catalyzed by the transition and not unduly impacted by it. The ICS, therefore, looks forward to continuing to work closely with the B20 in Italy and supporting the incoming host of the G20 as they lead efforts to overcome the pandemic while fostering a sustainable, balanced, and inclusive recovery to ensure that the world is better prepared to cope with unforeseen shocks in future and to urgently address the challenges of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paulson, for those remarks. And it's also my great pleasure to introduce Professor Enrico Giovannini, the Italian Minister for Sustainable Infrastructures and Mobility. Minister.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you, and congratulations to Emma and this B20-G20 Dialogue for the great work that she and the group is doing, also in preparation of the autumn events where Italy will present the conclusions of an intensive and complex year of negotiations and discussions. The good news is that not only the G7 meeting just a few days ago, but the meetings held so far by the G20 share a common vision about the future. And the common vision is a vision of prosperity and a more inclusive prosperity, but respecting the environment. The pandemic has taught to us how everything is interlinked, not only in terms of environment, society, and economy, but also the interlinks between countries, among international and geopolitical areas. So it's something that's made clear to everybody how interconnected are our lives. But also the crisis had shown limits, risks, and the fragility of a so developed system in the name of efficiency. Now everybody is talking about resilience. But I can tell you that almost 5 years ago, when as consultant to the European Commission President Juncker, I was talking about sustainable development and resilience as a keyword, I was told that I had to stop talking about these issues because I was told the Commission will never embrace these concepts in future. Now, 5 years later, I'm happy, of course, that sustainable development and the 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement is a common basis and very strong, let's say, commitment for Europe and not only. But the crisis has made clear how vulnerable our systems are and how resilient they have to be built. In Europe, as you may know, the plan that all countries has developed under the umbrella of the Next Generation EU, the plan to reinforce our economies and relaunch prosperity in our countries, well, the official name is Plan for Recovery and Resilience. How to do that? That, beside the buzzword, is, I think, one of the key issues that all policymakers have to face. But not only policymakers, also companies, also business people. 3 questions, and maybe Professor Goldin will address this later on. You remember last year, after the beginning of the pandemic, people were talking a lot about reshoring as in contrast with the offshoring, let's say, tendency that we have seen over the years. What does it mean, reshoring? It's the idea that if you just build production chains looking at efficiency without considering the vulnerability, you may end with a very fragile system of international trade. In Europe, some people were talking about regional integration, much more than global integration. Now, 1 year later, I think some of these issues are still on the table, and now with the recovery going on, we will better understand what companies will be doing. And it's likely that both tendencies will characterize our systems. In this context, we know that the maritime transport will continue to be fundamental and even more fundamental than before, but not necessarily the same as before, just looking at the very transcontinent chains. Maybe if there will be a stronger tendency to regional integration, there will be new flows of maritime transport, not necessarily within the same geopolitical sphere, for example, the European Union, but through or by geopolitical, I would say, entities that are not as far as in the past and in the future, given the trends that we expect for the development. Africa, I think, is one of the key examples of a potential rebalancing of flows. Let me add one point here, is that climate change is indeed changing the landscape. With global warming, we know that northeast direction is being opened and maybe will be much more open than before. This will produce relevant changes in the way in which goods arrive to Europe from Asia, but also vice versa. So what I'm just arguing here is that in the future we will have still with us shocks, negative or positive, not all negative, that will change the direction of trade and also the characteristics of this trade. This is why, because among other initiatives, I had established as one of the very first actions in this new capacity, a scientific committee exactly on climate change and the competencies of our ministry which covers infrastructures and transport. And on the other hand, the change of the name of this ministry into sustainable infrastructures and mobility, which is much more than just transport, is a clear indication of where we should be going. In practical terms, we have been spent the last 4 months working very hard in finalizing and now in implementing the National Plan for Recovery and Resilience, where we put 4 billion euros of investments in our ports. It's the first time ever that the Italian government has put so much money on our ports. And this is just a focus on ports in order to have them greener, but also more attractive for international trade flows in terms of logistical infrastructures and also digitalization, because we know how important digitalizing services and also the access to administrative forms and so on is so important for international traders. But if we just focus on the ports, we would miss the big picture that is behind the plan, because we decided to invest a lot of money also on the special economic zones, which are especially in the south of our country, that are the retroports, where it's possible to develop manufacturing activities, services activities, very close to the ports. And this is not really necessarily conceived only considering our ports as an entry point, but an exit point from Italy, and in theory from Europe as a whole. And this is why, as a third step, we have invested a lot, 25 billion euros on trains connections, not only for citizens, but also for freight. And we developed several projects for the last mile, which means the connection between ports, airports, and railways. I don't want to go in depth in this kind of plan. And you will find some slides also in English on our website, but it's just to say that the plan has really an integrated vision at its base, and it doesn't cover the entire investments, because also other national funds will be allocated to this. Let me just conclude with 2 remarks. The first one is about the technological limits we are facing in terms of greening our ships and in general to speed up the ecological transformation of the fleets. We invest money on that also for the short-term connections, for example, between Sicily and Calabria, and also in other areas of the country. But we know that for long-term traffic, we still do not have available technologies that would allow really to cut down severely the emissions. We know that there are several centers and private companies investing on that, but contrary maybe to the car traffic, is much more difficult to identify what could be the solution. And why the solution is so important, not only because of the economies of scale, but also because we have to make ports ready to interact with this kind of new energies. And the very last point is that I know that the G7 has agreed on a worldwide initiative under the heading Building Back Better, which is being used all over the world. I have to say that, of course, I accept this, but I find it maybe not completely capable to describe what we should do. In the work that I mentioned before with the Commission, we were talking about bouncing forward. In other words, we don't want to go back, even differently. We want to take this opportunity really to bounce forward and to move forward towards the Paris Agreement targets, with the need for developing and developed countries to deeply reorganize our socio-economic systems to make them really compatible with the global and planetary boundaries. We know the oceans are in very bad shape, and therefore, as oceans are really the language, I would say, of our planet, we need to speed up the transformation of our transport systems in order to reduce dramatically the pollution, to avoid the damage that is done to our common good. And this is where Italy and the G20 may really play a fundamental role in this respect. Thank you again.
Minister, thank you so much, and thank you so much for those remarks. Now, it's my great pleasure actually to introduce my panel called Muscle Up, Global Infrastructure Networks for More Sustainable Trade and Investments, which really encapsulates some of the themes that we were just hearing about. Now, let me just, first of all, go to my panelists that we'll hear from in about 6-7 minutes. Barbara Beltrame, Chair of B20 Task Force, Trade and Investment. Raffaello Ruggeri, Deputy Chair, B20 Task Force, Finance and Infrastructure, also Chief Lending Officer, Intesa Sanpaolo. Mario Mattioli, President Confitarma, Massimo De Andreis, General Manager SRM, Center for Economic Studies and Research, SRM Studi e Ricerche per il Mezzogiorno, Intesa Sanpaolo. Ingrid Sinclair, Co-Chair of the B20 Task Force, Trade and Investment and Global President, Siemens Life Cycles Services, and John Denton, Co-Chair, B20 Task Force, Finance and Infrastructure, and Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. So I'm looking forward to the panel, but before we go to that, let's go straight to Professor Ian Golding, a Professor of Globalization Development, University of Oxford, to set the scene. Professor, take it away.
Thank you very much, Francine. It's a great honor and privilege to be able to follow from Professor Enrico Giovanni, Esben Poulsen, and Emma Marsagaglia to set the stage for the panel on this vital topic. And I do want to congratulate the B20 for this initiative. As the Minister indicated, there are problems in thinking about the future as simply building back better, because we need to think differently. We need to have this pandemic as a wake-up call. And if it doesn't serve that function, if we carry on the same tracks that we've been on, we're heading over a cliff, and we will have future pandemics, escalating climate crises, and others. And so even if, as we bounce forward, let's make sure we don't bounce forward on the same track, on the same road. We need to change our ways. And unless we do so, I believe this pandemic will be tragically wasted. As I argue in a new book, Rescue: From Global Crisis to a Better World, the jury is out. It's vitally important that we hear the alarm bell that this pandemic has sounded and do things in many ways differently. We're already seeing that, and that's what's so encouraging. We're already seeing it in the way that governments are behaving. We're already seeing it in the extraordinary change in our behaviors. We're already seeing it in the collaboration around the development of the vaccines, and we're seeing it in conversations in the G7, the B20, and the G20. We need to give these more impetus and momentum to ensure they are sustained. And that, I believe, is vital. In terms of infrastructure, about $1 trillion a year is required in new infrastructure. It needs to learn the lessons of the financial crisis, where financial stimulus focused on infrastructure led to a rapid increase in carbon emissions, because infrastructure spent on steel, infrastructure spent on cement does not achieve the goal of green growth, and does not either meet the needs of our time. And so thinking very differently about how we design the infrastructure stimulus package, thinking about how we use it to create the jobs and inclusiveness and sharing that Emma spoke about is absolutely vital at this time. A century ago, there was a roaring 20s, and I think we will be followed again this year and in the coming years by a massive increase in spending generated by a desire to return to our lives and spend the money that's been saved during the pandemic. And we're seeing it in many respects. A century ago, excess consumption led to unsustainable growth, a Great Depression, the rise of inequality, protectionism, nationalism, and an even worse war than the First World War. We need to learn that lesson too. This time, let's make the roaring 20s associated with roaring because we are investing in the future, in health to make this the pandemic to end all pandemics, investing in education, in overcoming inequality, and of course in the transition to a zero carbon world. Is that possible? It certainly is. Debt can be increased and be sustainable if it is spent on investment. If it's spent on consumption, it is not sustainable. Then we get inflationary spikes, then we will see a debt crisis, and we will see negative outcomes from this increased investment. But if the investment is spent in ways that lead to greater growth in our countries, more productivity, more inclusiveness, overcoming the needs, and global growth, and that is vital because so far, while the rich countries have found $17 trillion for themselves, far less than 1%, far less than 100 billion has been found for developing countries. Indeed, aid has been cut for many developing countries at a time when it's never been needed more. Getting back to the SDGs will require increased not only debt write-offs, but also transfers of funding from the rich countries. What the pandemic has done is accelerate globalization. Some have talked about deglobalization. This has not been the case. In fact, in many respects, we have record levels of investment, not least in China. We have trade flows which are peaking on the Trans-Pacific and Asian routes, and of course, the digital leap that we have all gone through. This accelerated transformation will lead to changes in supply chains. It's accelerating the rise of Asia. It's accelerating particularly the transformation of technologies as well embedded in supply chains, including automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence. This means that increasingly low-cost goods will be made at home by machines in repetitive automated processes. The reshoring, and Minister Giovannini asked specifically about this, will occur, but it will not be a reshoring of labor, of labor-intensive production. It's a reshoring of capital-intensive production processes with automated products, whether it's a T-shirt being automated or a call center, back offices in the cloud, digital services. This is all what created an international division of labor to harvest low-cost labor around the world. The new international division of labor will be different. We need to be very mindful of the point as well that was raised by Professor Giovannini regarding fragility in supply chains. We've seen dramatic examples of this in recent months, what I call the butterfly defect of globalization, the fragility that comes from increasingly complex nodes and networks in our systems. This needs to be managed to ensure resilience by diversification. And although there's been much talk, including in the European Union, of dependence on international supplies, the fact of the matter is that 99% of European needed supplies in COVID have come from within the European Union, and none of the top 4 supplies that have been needed have come from outside it. That reflects both, I believe, successful integration within Europe, as well as diversification when needed. So the balance needs to be struck. At the same time, investments in ocean, in sea shipping, need to be greatly accelerated. We will see over the coming decades ocean rise. We will see increasing weather extremes. We will see ports being threatened by this, and salinity encroachment as well of water supplies. How shipping copes with this and how trade copes with the transformation simultaneously of technologies of artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation with extreme climate events is going to be a key question. My own view is that we need to assist the shipping industry in the transformation to zero carbon. This cannot be done without a predictable, as has been said by Esben Poulsen, predictable demand for zero carbon ships. It cannot also be done globally without support financially for developing countries that need to make these investments. And simultaneously, it requires public investment as well as private and industry-wide investment in research and development. All of this is possible if we think differently, collectively, and in new ways. My great hope is that the pandemic has been this wake-up call that has led us to work in new ways, and that by thinking in fresh ways, the B20, together with the G20, will be able to collaborate with the shipping industry and with other partners in the maritime transportation infrastructure sector to ensure that we create out of this crisis a better world and that all the suffering has not been in vain. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you so much. Now, I'd love I've introduced the panelists. So my first question, thank you for that. You know, there were some really heartfelt remarks there and so many questions that really need to be answered. So let me go straight to Barbara Beltrame to kick us off. Barbara, so we heard from the minister, we heard from various very esteemed professors. If you look at maritime transport, it's really the backbone of world trade. And I was reminded, preparing for this and looking at some of the figures, it's approximately 90% of global trade by volume, which is carried by sea. So Barbara, what are the B20 recommendations actually to ensure that there's, high efficiency across borders?
Thank you very much, Francine. You are absolutely right. We need to rethink the infrastructure of the world trade, including the maritime transport, of course. The Ever Given episode is really shocking. Allow me to start with a few general remarks. Trade import restrictions at global level have increased dramatically in the last 10 years, from around 1% in 2010 to over 10% in 2019. Global value chains have been confronted with heavy disruption and containment measures, and yet they have proven very resilient. Businesses have made a great effort in order to anticipate better, getting prepared early, and adapting their operation faster. Unfortunately, the adoption of a national first approach has resulted in a growing numbers of export restrictions without coordination. Now, I would like to share some concerns. Service trade cost increased by 12% of export values across sectors and countries. Furthermore, as B20, we are concentrated about calls for policies to reshoring global value chain, localize production, and divide our economies. This kind of narrative does not reflect the reality of business. We need more regional diversification and not less to protect businesses from sudden shocks. So governments should work more closely with the private sector. And this can be done by ensuring predictable regulatory policies. This should reduce uncertainty, in particular during times of crisis. To this aim, the B20 will for current and cooperative international approaches along 3 action lines. The first one is promote effective international guidelines for crisis response. The second, upgrade customers' procedure to faster efficiently of cross-border flows. And the third action line is to advance the interoperability of global value chain and improve trade infrastructures. Therefore, we call on the G20 to prioritize and promote sustainable and longer-term investment, including new digital technology in order to improve international transportation networks.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that. I'd like to call on Raffaello Ruggeri, Deputy Chair B20 Task Force, with you know, if you can try and answer following what Barbara was saying, Raffaello, which is as governments really turn to the, you know, to the recovery from a pandemic, from a pretty awful 14 months that we had, what priorities should be considered to try and, you know, deal with infrastructure, finance and investment?
Many thanks, Francine. Many thanks to Emma and Minister Giovannini for this privilege. I wish to thank the G20 Italy, B20 Italy and International Chamber of Shipping for their kind invitation to this dialogue. I am happy to meet you at the beginning of a possible recovery phase, sharing a sense of more safety and trust. The real challenge for us, for all of us, is now to make such recovery solid, inclusive and sustainability for at last the next 10 years, as Minister Giovannini mentioned. We all share the belief that the pandemic accelerated the world into the futures. There are potential forces and trends already at work before COVID-19 that have intensified during the pandemic and will still affect the world in 2025 and far beyond. Too often I hear the question, how soon can we get back to normal? Is this what we really want? We are at a very turning point. Our task force shared the message, new times for other ideas and new ideas for other times, from an artwork made by an Italian artist. At the same time, the pandemic has made it more evident that the models of economic development need to be restructured with a greater focus on sustainability, respect for the environment, execution of a vision for metropolitan areas as places where citizens, an international mix of families, students, senior people can truly locally with everything they need, just a short walk or a bike ride away. The COVID-19 crisis is forcing us to imagine new growth paradigms for our urban areas. Therefore, investing in urban regeneration project and sustainability infrastructure is a key driver of new economic and social growth and a critical enabler to achieving the SDG commitments, also in view of the COP26 summit in November. Proximity should be a value because it enables the possibility of taking care of others. On the other side, there is a widespread consensus that the governments alone cannot afford to bridge these growing infrastructure gaps, and the participation of the private sector, including banks and institutional investors such as insurance, pension funds, and asset managers, can help reduce pressure on public finance, fostering an increase in the portfolio of investable projects. There are several reasons for the growing collaboration between the public and the private sector in developing and providing infrastructure services. To involving banking, insurance system and private investor in supporting infrastructure modernization, it's essential to create dedicated, standardized and market-based solution through platform and co-investment tools. If I may mention three pragmatic proposals. First, urban regeneration infrastructure funds managed with an impact approach focused on social infrastructure and with the vision of taking care of people by creating an environment more favorable to the development of their untapped potential. Second, international impact finance programs such as Rinascimento project launched by Intesa Sanpaolo, which during the pandemic, which tested the strengths and the success of the partnership between public and private, with the fundamental contribution of ONGs to accelerate urban regeneration in territories. Finally, impact funds for the international supply chains to develop an innovation ecosystem with digital and sustainable infrastructure service districts, corporate and SMEs. In summary, a key priority is to maximize the value and social impact of Triple P by imagining a new equation where triple P stands for people, prosperity, and planet, and where the public-private scheme partnership is at the service of people, prosperity, and the planet's growth. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Raffaello. Let me now get over to Mario Mattioli. What are the main, Mario, critical issues in Italy concerning transport infrastructure, but also traffic development in general?
I pressed the wrong button. Hi, good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for your question, Francine. First of all, we have to look at Italy. Italy is a country with 8,500 kilometers of coastline. We are an old country. We have many ports. Most of them are historical ports within the cities. This means small dimensions. Italy is depending 70% on its import on the sea, so importation by sea, and about 55% of the export is done by sea. So it has a crucial, the seaway has really a crucial role within Italy. As I was mentioning, one of the main issues is the fact that many ports are historical ports and are within cities. So there is a difficulty in expansion from this point of view. Then we have a big problem in Italy, that is the bureaucracy. I mean, we have one of the key issues of the next generation EU will be the reforms, and I'm pretty confident that standing and the competence of the actual government will finally, and also the fact that it is backed by a vast majority within our parliament, will be the right moment to make these reforms, because otherwise it will be virtually impossible for us to grow. When I mean reform, I mean less bureaucracy, and definitely a bureaucracy that is at the service of the industry and not vice versa, as many times we see today. One other important issue will be for the expansion of the traffics in the future will be the digitalization. We know that another important pillar of the next generation EU is dedicated to technologies, to the development of technology, and mainly to the digitalization. This will be a great help together with the maintenance and the expansion of the actual spaces that we have within the port. Just I want to mention in conclusion one important step is that we in Italy we are considered to be a sort of platform within Mediterranean. So we should be the landing point, the door to Europe. On the other way around, the Italian gap on logistics is virtually about 70 billion of euro. That means that all the main industries of our country, they do import their goods through the North Europe gateway rather than the Mediterranean gateway that is Italy. And this means that in any case, the ships will have to spend 7 days going up to North Europe and 7 days going down from North Europe back to the Suez Canal. So nevertheless, even with this important difference in terms of steam for the ships, still we have this problem. And this generates, as I said, a gap of 70 billion euro per year for the Italian country. So I hope that with the reforms, we will be able to fill this gap. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, let me ask Ingrid Sinclair how disruption in the maritime transport, of course, adversely impact sustainability, but also some of the circular economy goals.
Thank you. Thank you, Francine. I would like to thank the B20 and in particular my chair, Barbara Beltrami, for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm speaking to you from the perspective of a global IT asset management company and electronics recycler. The unfettered global transport of secondary materials is critical to the transition from a linear take, make, dispose stepwise economic model to a circular economic model. Historically, the linear model, resources are considered unlimited, with raw materials being mined and processed into a product that is thrown away after use. Circular economic models promote sustainability with sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, and recycling existing materials and products if possible. In this context, secondary materials play a huge role in terms of energy savings, combating climate change, and keeping resources in the ground. With the shortage of sea containers due to COVID-19 and other geopolitical factors impacting global maritime transport, manufacturers are trending towards opting for what has traditionally been the easiest, quickest, yet most unsustainable option to keep up production, which is the mining of virgin materials, often in places that have lacking the environmental and technical capacity to do so. In my view, it is important that policy decisions made at the G20 level recognize the importance of secondary materials in the context of the supply chain shortages brought on by maritime transport delays. Disruption of the flow of secondary materials has social and environmental consequences versus just economic. It is down to the long-term sustainability versus the short-term financial gain of getting materials rapidly to a manufacturing site. I'm not in the position to prescribe a policy mix of incentives or subsidies. I leave that to the policymakers, but I do think it is important to highlight the importance of facilitating a reliable flow of secondary materials for recycling, both in terms of global value chain, stability, and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ingrid Sinclair. Massimo De Andres, how do you encourage cross-border infrastructure cooperation in ports and logistics in order to facilitate sustainability in global trade?
Thanks, Francine. Let me first thank the organizer for inviting me to this distinguished meeting. Let me also say that in SRM, which is the Economic Research Center I'm working for in Intesa Sanpaolo Banking Group, we are specialized in maritime economy, which is a key sector for Italian economy and of course for Intesa Sanpaolo being the leading Italian bank. So to answer to your question, I think maritime logistics can play a fundamental role to encourage cross-border infrastructure cooperation and to facilitate sustainability in global trade, simply because, as we have seen, we must consider that 90% of world trade is seaborne. In many countries, ports are public authorities, and it's up to the local government to invest in the modernization of physical infrastructures, such as berth, docks, or dredging. But then the level of private investment is strictly interdependent. This is a very important point. It's strictly interdependent on the efficiency and the quality of public investment. And is also strategic and essential for any further development of the infrastructure. So it is urgent, I think, to invest to make ports more sustainable. Coal ironing is a clear example, and to support the same process for the entire shipping industry. We should also consider that ports have a strategic role as energy hubs for new green energy production and distribution. This is true for European ports, but also for Asian and American ports. So my point is that if we support investment in sustainability for logistics, ports, and shipping, we also support sustainability for global trade, because we know that ports have proven to be essential not only for export and for the economy as a whole, but also to ensure the efficiency of supply chain, the improvement of the economies of scale, and to foster cross-border investments. If we want a clear example, we can take the port of Tanger Med in Morocco. This port is now a logistic platform serving and linking north and south to the Mediterranean. This infrastructure has become the top container port in the Mediterranean in just 10 years, thanks to the significant investment by the Moroccan government. That's more, it boasts a surrounding area as well as a free zone with about 900 companies, many of which from Morocco, Spain, and France. These firms are operating in many sectors, but mainly in the automotive sector, as it is the case with Renault and its subcontractors, All of this represent a clear example of an integrated North-South supply chain based on the Euro-Mediterranean region. So when we talk about reshoring, when we talk about the regionalization of the globalization, let's also think to the Euro-Mediterranean zone. But not only Tangier, I mean, a similar effective example could be provided by the case of many other ports in the Mediterranean region, which is more and more strategic for maritime economy and trade, thanks to the doubling of the Suez Canal, which is a key strategic logistic hub. So improving efficiency and sustainability in ports and logistics boost efficiency in supply chain and contributes to stimulate trade and industrial relations between countries. And this is, I think, what we need. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. John Denton, the ICC, of course, is deeply involved in the B20 process right from the beginning. What makes this topic so important for the ICC and its members?
It's great to be with so many friends and familiar faces in one of my favorite G20 hubs, which is Italy. So thanks for all you're doing at the B20 for Italy. It's and for the world. I think it's so far a very successful B20, and I've been involved in every one since the beginning, but don't hold me responsible for the ones that didn't go so far. But this one I think will. So we're deeply involved because we're committed to the B20 process because of the importance of the G20's work and the need for it to systematically take into consideration business views. We really appreciate that aspect. Interesting when you look at the G20 agenda over the last years, it's interesting to see how it's grown and grown. It's sort of moved out of its initial framing around crisis management, and it now has work streams covering almost all aspects of the economy. Arguably, it looks a little bit like a Christmas tree, or which different aspects are now hung. The important thing, of course, is not to forget the tree itself, which is always about growing the global economy. And it's important that we never lose sight of the prime role of the G20, which is actually to support economic growth, but which, by the way, is what the ICC does. What we do is we grow the economy, revitalize global trade, and advance sustainability, all thematically completely relevant to what the Italy G20 and B20 processes support. Let's not forget as well that the day-to-day work of the G20 actually has a huge impact on business. And for that work to be as effective as possible, it needs to draw in expertise from the global business community. That's why we're very happy to participate as a network partner. In fact, Shinta, who is, I know, is scheduled to try and join this call, who's actually part of the ICC Executive Board, will chair the B20 next year in Indonesia. And also my current chair, Ajay Banga, is also a participant. This is the importance we attach to participate in these levels of debate and discussion. I'm just thinking about the importance of the G20 this year and why, therefore, and the question you asked, why we're so involved. This is a pretty critical year. And that's particularly because of the consequences and the ongoing effect of the pandemic and the economic devastation that it's unleashed. And many of you would know we are the champions of the real economy. We launched an incredibly effective Save Our SME campaign to bring attention, though sadly, we've not been able to save as many SMEs as we would like because of the devastating impact of the pandemic on the real economy. But to fix the economy and get growth back, what we have to do is fix the pandemic. And this is a point I've made to G7 leaders, G20 leaders, regional leaders, and all other places. The reason we're involved, for example, and I sit on the COVAX Council, is because to bring an end to the pandemic through the successful equitable distribution of vaccines throughout the world is the best way of getting growth back into the global economy. And so what we would say is that the first thing the G20 must do, and I welcome the opportunity to have spoken with the G20 Sherpa not so long ago and actually articulated these views, the G20 as a group must deepen its financial commitment to the ACT Accelerator set up under COVAX. It's still woefully underfunded by something like 18 billion. We were deeply disappointed in the quality of outcome from the G7 on this regard, though we do note the constructive comments made by Prime Minister Draghi. Secondly, the G20 trade ministers, and picking up some of the themes that I've heard echoed through the other speakers here, who for years have had a commitment to avoid protectionism, must remove existing trade barriers on vaccines and therapeutics, which are actually critical to the treatment and the eradication of the virus. If you actually look at the trade protection the numbers that are coming out, there's actually an increase. And sadly, that increase is being led in many cases by developed economies. So removing trade barriers and restrictions. If you want to get trade moving, Massimo, you actually have to lift these export restrictions and allow services and goods to actually cross the borders. Third, we need a massive coordination and investment. This is absolutely critical from us to actually ensure that we build a functioning supply chain. We don't want to get caught up in debates around trips. The fundamental issue here is the need to increase production and access to supply. Increasing production must be our full focus of what we're working on. We've set up ICC war rooms, and I know that this is a very strong issue for the G20 in Italy, and it's another reason why we're involved, because we want to make certain that this is seen by G20 leaders as a business issue, an economic issue, and we want their support and help in it. And finally, the world needs a longer-term pandemic plan. And these are elements that we're already seeing shaped through the Italy G20 agenda with a special focus on health, as should be expected. But actually thinking forward to a longer-term pandemic plan that includes funding for COVAX beyond this year is actually quite critical. Which brings me to finance and infrastructure itself, which is equally important and in many ways more long-term in nature. We've heard a little bit, and each speaker has spoken about the commitment to sustainable infrastructure. I come to this discussion not only as Secretary General of the ICC, but also as a board member of one of the two largest Australian infrastructure investors. In my case, it's IFM, and we're proud, by the way, to have recently completed an acquisition in Italy, the Bremeni toll road, which actually involved Intesa as well. And we are very engaged with the prospects for infrastructure investment in Italy. But we are also committed to achieving a net zero emissions. We also own ports like Mersin. We own ports in Mersin in Turkey. We own ports in Poland. We own ports in North America. We are major infrastructure investors. And as I say, we are committed to net zero emissions. But we do know that it will require financial markets to facilitate this transition to sustainability. There will not be one tool to do this. And we need to work with governments to get the incentives right for a range of tools, public-private partnerships. We need to ensure that the public, the governments actually trust the private sector investment, that they're not seeing public-private partners as somehow a political negative, but we actually should be encouraging them as the business community see them as a net positive, a problem solver. And we need to point to more case studies where public-private partnerships have actually worked to achieve the effective levels of investment in infrastructure to enable the Build Back Better, the green growth, the digital investment that everyone talks about. These things we need, whether that's through facilitating impact investing, making it easy to incorporate ESG into financial analysis, through standards in reporting, or fostering access for MSMEs to affordable, sustainable financial products. So we at the ICC, we are an organisation committed to addressing climate change and ensuring financial inclusion. We want globally aligned ESG standards. The actual taxonomy needs to be aligned. We want it as quickly as possible, because that's how money will move to sustainable goods, services and investment. But there's a risk of fragmentation with different standards in different parts of the world that would undermine progress. And so the B20's recommendations in this regard, coming up with common sustainable financial taxonomies, aligning ESG disclosure frameworks and their implementation, is absolutely critical for the transition of sectors to net zero. That's really important. By the way, a particularly important element for ICC is that ESG and impact investing reporting standards must be truly global and harmonized in nature. So I just want to pause and stop at that point, because this is a key element, I think, of the recommendations which we'll see coming through the B20 into the G20. It's a fairly easy win, and also it creates the platform for much larger scale investment across the globe. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Great, thank you so much, John. Barbara, following on from that, and I would love to ask everyone actually to keep your remarks fairly short, because we are unfortunately running out of time. Like, time flies when you're having fun. Barbara, I know there was also, the G20 and the B20, representatives meeting with the World Trade Organization, new Secretary General. What were the topics that were discussed, and what kind of, opportunity is there of those two bodies working together?
Yes, along with Emma Marcegaglia, I had the pleasure to meet her last May, during her first visit in Italy. First of all, let me say that her appointment set an historical achievement. She's the first woman and the first African to hold this position, a much awaited change that brings a wind of hope, of a new hope actually, of inclusion. We met a very skilled and a passionate woman, and we had a very faithful and productive conversation. The reform of the WTO is top on the B20 agenda, and we look forward to working with her in view of the 12th Ministerial Conference that will take place in November. An effective rule-based multilateral trading system with the WTO on its core is more than ever essential to address the current challenges. With Dr. Ngozi, we address all top priorities in the WTO agenda. The first priority is the need to fill the vacant seat in the appellate body and restore an effective dispute settlement system. As for notification and monitoring, we stress the need to increase the compliance of national trade policies with the WTO rules. We also discussed on how to accelerate ongoing negotiation. The B20 support the ongoing WTO negotiation to improve transparency and reduce barriers to trade in services. The agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures should be reviewed, and the government procurement agreement should be extended. Encourage all WTO members to join in. Last but not least, to improve the dialogue with the business community, we would welcome the creation of a regular consultative mechanism. Business can help governments and international organizations. We can show the way and help make the difference. Thank you, Francis.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Barbara, let's get to Raffaello. And Raffaello, I guess, in your opinion, what are some of the policies that are needed in order to allow financial institutions to really put money behind and provide long-term capital for this sustainable infrastructure?
I have the privilege of guiding as Deputy Chair the B20 Italy Finance Infrastructure Task Force. John Tenton is our pivotal player and important co-chair. Our works are not finalized yet, therefore allow me to just give you a flavor of some recommendations we are aiming to bring to the attention of the G20 policymakers later in autumn. In order to allow financial institutions to provide long-term and patient capital, as you mentioned, for sustainable infrastructure and urban regeneration projects aimed at achieving measurable environmental and social return for relevant stakeholders. We believe that three fundamental policy actions are needed. The first, creating a market-friendly public-private partnership model with funding schemes based on result-based financing solutions. We believe that the use of a public-private partnership model is able to mobilize and aggregate a growing volume of private and public resources, favoring the realization of massive infrastructure projects, as well as the maintenance of current infrastructure to bring them in line with current sustainability metrics. At the same time, the adoption of a result-based financing solution represents a core step to foster intervention, focusing on the achievement of measurable social and environmental outcomes, and to incentivize private purchase involved in the project to the best execution. Second, transforming sustainable infrastructure in the mainstream asset class, acting also on standards and taxonomy to speed up the ability of the investor to make capital allocation choices that support the transition to a sustainable economy and mitigate the risk of greenwashing. Through this labeling system, the market can easily signal the sustainability of the asset, and investors can trust that their money is going to projects that meet environment, social resiliency, and the governance needs and contribute to SDGs. A sustainable infrastructure label will assure that governments and project developers embed high environment, social, government, and resilience standards into new infrastructure design and pre-construction phases on the grounds that only asset incorporating standard will obtain the label. Creating an adequate policy and regulatory environment, third point, to allow financial institutions to provide long-term and patient capital, yielding low rates for urban regeneration projects, aiming at achieving measurable environment and social return for relevant stakeholders. As mentioned by Carlo Messina, our CEO, it's time to make things happen. A further reason to have an actionable proposal for sustainable infrastructure. For this, we need a recovery impact plan with the execution capabilities to tackle the social aspects of future's growth and its impact of inequality. We need to think how to achieve quality of life through service infrastructure. For me, at Intesa Sanpaolo, this is the very game changer. What does quality of life through service infrastructure mean for us? It means investment in amenities, hospitals, mobility, transport, road maintenance, efficient telecommunication, schools and education to ensure healthy lives and to promote well-being for all at all stages. If I mention two examples, Milano Sesto project, of one of European most significant urban redevelopment plans. Let me also add, from the point of view of the banking sector, that existing regulatory accounting requirements should be made current with infrastructure financing, which require long-term investment and long-term credit of 20 and other years. Right. Many thanks, Francine.
Great, thank you so much, Raffaello. Let me go straight to Mario Mattioli. What is how you see the relationship working between shipping and finance at this moment?
Thank you, Francine. Shipping and finance have always had a very strong interrelation during the years. Shipping is considered to be a high intensive asset-based investment. So, of course, a ship is costing a lot, is lasting many years, and it is a very high intensity capital. So there has always been a strong interrelation between the two things. Now, what I think is important in this particular moment, because we are coming out of a long crisis since 2008, in which, especially for shipping, I mean, all the traditional banking system has in a certain way, I don't want to say disappeared, but for sure is less interested than it was at the beginning. I think that at the moment, as it is clear, shipping is an infrastructure, is a very powerful, a very important infrastructure. And in this particular moment, we are in a sort of transitional period. What does it mean, transitional period? It means that we have to target to a 2030, 2050 period in which the decarbonization, the net zero, will be almost achieved. We can get there with two, in my opinion, with two things. The first one is that the infrastructure is still there, meaning that the intervention and the sustainability to the backbone that is done by, especially in Italy, but not only in Italy, by small and medium enterprises done, and this must be done via, of course, the sustain of the finance, namely banking side has to cope a lot with that. At the same time, this period of transition should, of course, then finance all the new investment in order to get to the more sustainable fuels, like the hydrogen, like the ammonia, and like what would be the transitional period, the LNG for the moment. So these two things are very, very heavy investment, and it is very important the role of finance over there. I just want to mention that one possible solution could be for instance, for the Italian market, where that I know quite well, and in which there are a lot of small and medium enterprises. I think that it would be important the role of the government through one of the big funds like the Cassa Depositi and Prestiti that may act as a sort of anchor investor for the Italian market in order to attract also private funds, either Italian or foreign, in order to sustain this industry for this transitional period, matching what will be the target of the net zero emission. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask Massimo De Andres, when you look at some of the critical factors that we've kind of touched on affecting transportation at the moment on the global stage, in this context, how does maritime infrastructure actually impact the role for sustainability? And if I could just ask everyone again to just keep it tight on time, like 1 or 2 minutes each. Thank you.
Thanks, Francine. Let me focus on 2 points. The first one is the need, I think, to encourage more private investments in ports. And the second one is the role of ports and logistics for green energy. On the first point, we should consider that in many countries, in the proximity of ports, there are located free zones with fiscal incentives and lower bureaucracy. This is the case, for example, of the Italian ZES, established a special economic zone, established by the government in southern Italian ports, which have been also supported by Intesa Sanpaolo. I believe that these are useful tools to attract private investors in logistics, but also in the industry sector, and also to attract research centers and to develop startup incubators around ports. I mean, at the end of the day, to develop what we call a sort of port ecosystem. And this could be a way to foster better efficiency and higher sustainability. My second point, which is the most important, I think, is on the role of ports and logistics as energy hubs for new green energy production and distribution. I think that these infrastructures have a strategic and key role to pursue of the decarbonization goal at the global level. If we look at Europe's relationship with the Southern Mediterranean over the last 15 years, for example, we clearly see that this partnership was based, and this is actually based, on the exchange of manufacturing products over oil and gas. In the Middle East and North Africa and the MENA countries has been and still is Europe's largest supplier of fossil fuels. If we want to have a long-term vision that looks to the coming decades and is in line with decarbonization and carbon neutrality goals, then this is the time, I think, to start building a new alliance between countries based on 2 elements: connectivity with ports and logistics and green economy. And this could be the case, for instance, between Europe and southern shore of the Mediterranean. Today, new technologies are making possible what yesterday was impossible: producing renewable energy in North Africa and bringing it to Europe in form of gas, I mean green gas, via existing pipelines. The connection will also require significant infrastructure investment, of course, both in terms of construction of new plants and interconnection. At this stage, I think the key element is clear. Modern ports are no longer merely a point of departure or arrival of goods and passengers, but represent a powerful development pole or development hubs, if you prefer, for industry, for innovation, for research, for energy. And around these areas, I mean around ports, employment and sustainable economic development can be generated. If government invests in sustainability for ports, private investors will follow, accelerating the economic impact on local development and cross-border economic cooperation. But, and I'm concluding, one additional condition is necessary, in my opinion: reciprocity in private business investment. Ports have proven to be strategic assets, in some cases also for national security, only if a legal framework of business-friendly reciprocity is accepted at the global or at the regional level. We can see ports, logistics, and shipping industry becoming a key driver of sustainability in the coming years. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Ingrid Sinclair, what role could the multilateral environmental and trade agreements play in actually promoting this circular economy, but also sustainable recovery?
Thanks, Francine. So from the perspective of a global recycler trying to move material around globally for recycling and life extension purposes, multilateral environmental and trade agreements must be implemented in a manner that effectively balances environmental, social, and economic considerations with decisions based upon sound metrics and robust scientific and technical information. So I'll give you an example of something that didn't work. Recently, there's been developments within the Basel Convention on the transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their control. In many ways, it went counter to the facilitation of legitimate and environmental sound management and transboundary movement of materials for recycling, as well as circular economy. So this example, to combat marine litter debris and plastic waste, the Basel Convention recently classified plastic waste as hazardous. Although I completely agree, plastic waste is a huge problem, especially in terms of marine debris, the decision to classify plastic waste as hazardous was adopted in record time for Basel standards in 9 months, which was amazing. And many in the private sector believe, engaged in recycling, believe the decision to regulate it as waste, the waste as hazardous, is not based on clear metrics, nor did it consider that a major source of marine litter and plastic pollution is due to a lack of solid waste infrastructure in small island states and developing countries. In fact, 80% of pollution to the marine environment comes from land, so it's not from legitimate means. So our position is that global waste initiatives should be strongly emphasized on the capacity building and technical assistance, not just regulating point blank. So again, something that didn't work and put into consideration that it's not even addressing the problem. So to reiterate, any multilateral agreement should be implemented based on metrics, science, and robust data. Thank you.
Thank you so much. John Denton, ESG and of course impact investment reporting stand at the front line of some of these business commitments. What works particularly well?
So thank you very much. As I was saying before, one thing that does work particularly well, and what's very important, a very important element for the ICC, is that ESG impact investing reporting standards are actually shaped as global and actually harmonized in nature. And this is a piece that we're missing. It's why, by the way, we're so supportive of what IFRS is doing and that initiative to develop a sustainability standards board. And we've spoken about this in a number of the discussions that have been shared in the Italy B20 Finance and Infrastructure Working Group. I mean, we know that there are many regional initiatives out there, but we need policymakers, most of all, to focus on those that offer the most realistic, quick and global solutions to sustainability standards. Otherwise, there's a risk of fragmentation. Otherwise, there's a risk of differing standards. And otherwise, there's a risk of creation of 2 or even 3 or 4-track financial markets. So we need to guard against this. When the reality is the scale of investments required in truly sustainable businesses and products is so great that we have no time to waste. I'm particularly interested in, and I noticed at the G7 communique, there was discussion of this as well. And it's also a particularly sharp issue, I think, in the G20, which is the focus on infrastructure investment, particularly in Africa. I take it so seriously that I recently agreed to join the advisory board of the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is actually founded by the African Ministers of Finance in order to ensure we do have a greening of infrastructure there. It was created last year by sovereign wealth funds and pension fund leaders and African finance ministers, and it is a fully African institutional investor-led global finance initiative. And I've been very pleased that I've been able to raise some of the issues most important to Africa in the G20 process because of the open nature of the discussions which we've been having in the Finance and Infrastructure Working Group. But it is important that the G20 represents and hears from an important continent because of the need for the kind of alignment to enable infrastructure investment and therefore economic growth in the Africa of the future. But what we do know is that Africa needs at least 100 billion per annum for the next 10 years to address energy emerging poverty across the continent and to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the biggest challenges are going to continue to be access to capital, building capability itself, alignment of policymakers with the private sector, and the actual aligning with global long-term investment communities like pension funds. And of course, an understanding of what bankable projects really are. And we hear a lot about that, but people don't really define what that is. And for us, a bankable project is one where it's clear how risk is allocated and to whom, and that requires detailed work. And we actually want to embark upon a process that enables that to happen. So getting global ESG standards right, shifting financial markets, the opportunities in green investments in Africa, these are going to be essential to enable Africa's energy transition. And it's something that I think will be very important to the global world as well. So thanks again for the opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful panel. Barbara Beltrame, Raffaello Ruggeri, Mario Mattioli, Massimo De Andreis, Ingrid Sinclair, and John Denton. Now, we're almost out of time, so I'd love to go to Esben Poulsen, actually chairman of the International Chamber of Shipping, ICS, for some closing remarks. Mr. Poulsen.
Well, Francine, according to my clock, it is now 2:30, so I don't think I have a lot of time. But I will say that for me, to be in what we call the shipping bubble and to join a session like this, to hear so many different aspects to trade and shipping has been tremendously interesting. I think the Build Back Better question mark that was put by Minister Giovanni and Ian Golding is interesting. And the point that investing in infrastructure as opposed to investing in a lot of consumption is probably the biggest single takeaway I've had from this. But I would also say that the reference to ports and the importance of ports interlinking and the role that ports play has been a very big point made here. Financing, we touched on the Poseidon principles that you probably will have heard about, which is an ESG-driven attempt by banks to lend more responsibly, will have an impact as time goes by. I think the circular economic model that Ingrid mentioned was extremely interesting, and a call to all of us to be less of a consumer and more of a recycler. Well, I would just say shipping is a brilliant industry. I've been in it 2 months or 1 month short of 50 years. And I've seen tremendous change and I've seen tremendous improvement. And what I've heard today gives me hope and confidence that we are on the right track and we will do what we need to do and we will get there. So thank you very much indeed for the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much. And I'd love to wish everyone a great afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And we've made it to time. And thank you for a very thoughtful and passionate discussion from everyone attending today. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.